It was a gray Tuesday morning, the kind where the light barely filters through the hospital blinds. I remember the hum of the fluorescent bulbs above me, the faint scent of disinfectant, the rhythmic clicking of keyboards in the hallway. Just another day at the neuropsychology clinic at Boston University Medical Center. I'd been doing this for nearly 20 years, assessing cognition, memory, perception, predictable work in an unpredictable field. But that morning, something happened that would tear a hole in everything I thought I understood about the human mind. My patient, Ethan Miller, was a 29-year-old software engineer, a quiet man with a calm smile and eyes that carried both intelligence and exhaustion. 6 months earlier, he'd survived a car accident that left him with a mild traumatic brain injury. Nothing catastrophic, but enough to affect his short-term memory and reaction time. He'd made remarkable progress in rehab, and today's session was meant to be routine, a standard battery of cognitive tests. We began with simple recognition. Exercises, faces, words, symbols flashing on the screen in randomized order. Ethan performed well, almost too well. His reaction times were sharp, consistent. But then, as I advanced to a set of visual prediction tasks, something changed. He started responding before the images appeared. At first, I thought it was lag. A monitor delay, a calibration error, maybe even my mistake. I restarted the program. Same result. Ethan pressed the button to identify the correct image a full second before the stimulus displayed on screen. Again and again. Perfect accuracy each time. "Are you seeing the images early?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, I just know what's coming." The room suddenly felt colder. I checked the timestamps, reviewed the code behind the test. Everything functioned perfectly. No glitches, no delays. Every response was logged seconds ahead of the actual stimulus. Statistically, it should have been impossible. I ran the test again. This time I shuffled the stimuli, randomized the order in real time. Ethan sat quietly, his fingers twitching slightly before each image appeared, like he was anticipating something deep in his subconscious. The results were the same. It's as if his brain is predicting reality, I remember whispering to myself. My hands trembled as I documented the session notes. I wanted to believe it was coincidence, something explainable, something grounded in physiology or perception bias. But deep down, a sliver of unease had already taken root. When Ethan left the clinic that day, I sat in the silence of my office long after the lights dimmed. I stared at the test data, the lines of code, the cold numerical precision of his results, and none of it felt real anymore. I'd spent years studying the mind's patterns, but that day, it felt like the mind was studying me. I couldn't sleep that night. The data from Ethan's session replayed in my head like a broken reel of film. Every number, every millisecond, every impossible prediction. By morning, I convinced myself I must have made a mistake, some unnoticed variable, a timing offset, anything. Scientists don't chase the paranormal, they chase reproducibility. So that's exactly what I set out to do. I arrived early at the clinic, coffee in hand, determined to dismantle the illusion. I rechecked every timestamp, the EEG logs, the synchronization protocols. All of it aligned perfectly. There was no lag, no code errors. The anticipatory spikes in Ethan's neural activity, specifically in his temporal and occipital lobes, occurred seconds before the stimuli presentation. Every time. The data was unshakable. By midday, I decided to bring in another set of eyes. Dr. Michael Reyes, neurologist, colleague, and skeptic. The kind of man who didn't believe anything that couldn't be dissected on a slide or scanned through a magnet. When I showed him the data, he frowned but didn't dismiss it. "We'll redo it," he said flatly. "Control every variable. Cameras, software logs, even environmental readings." The following day, we reran the test. Ethan returned calm as ever, though a quiet tension hung around him. We double-checked the system, 2 independent computers, synced clocks, triple-layered data logging. Ethan sat in front of the monitor, electrodes mapping his brain activity. When the first image flashed, a geometric shape, he identified it before it even appeared. The EEG spiked preemptively. The room went still. Reyes looked at the monitor, then at me. "Run it again," he said. We did, 10 times. Different stimuli, randomized intervals, same result. Ethan's brain reacted before reality unfolded. Afterward, I sat with Reyes in the dark control room, staring at the monitor. He finally broke the silence. "Could it be precognition?" he said with an uneasy laugh. It wasn't a real question, more of an attempt to make the unthinkable sound absurd, but his voice cracked when he said it. That night, I uploaded all session data to a secured research drive. I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, not just in my work, but in my understanding of time itself. The next morning, my office phone rang. It was Ethan's wife, Sarah. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Dr. Bennett, something's wrong. Ethan's been waking up in the middle of the night. He says he's seen things before they happen. He says he can't turn it off." Her words sent a chill through me. I glanced at the EEG still displayed on my screen, the anticipatory spikes like heartbeat patterns of something beyond comprehension. I wanted to dismiss it all as coincidence. I really did. But the data didn't care what I wanted. Ethan returned 3 days later, but the man who walked into my office was not the same patient I had tested before. His face was pale, eyes hollow, the confident software engineer now replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. He sat down quietly, fingers trembling slightly as he spoke. "They're not dreams anymore, Dr. Bennett," he whispered. "They're previews." He explained that every time he closed his eyes, flashes of moments would appear, small, vivid fragments that would later unfold in reality. Sarah spilling coffee on the counter, his phone ringing seconds before it did, a nurse dropping a clipboard down the hall. At first, he thought it was coincidence, but when he described a car crash at an intersection near his apartment and saw it happen exactly as he had described hours later, he began to break. I listened, keeping my tone steady, my notes professional. But inside, I felt something shift. I'd heard countless accounts of hallucinations, déjà vu, and temporal distortion, common among patients recovering from traumatic brain injuries. Yet this didn't fit any known pathology. His EEG patterns were unlike anything I'd seen. They didn't spike randomly, they anticipated. To rule out psychological suggestion, I set up a new test. This time, we used a random sequence generator to display unpredictable images on the screen. Neutral photographs, abstract colors, unfamiliar faces. The software was sealed until activation. There was no way for Ethan to know what was coming. As the session began, I monitored his EEG in real time. The first few slides were normal. Then his breathing changed, slow, deliberate, his gaze unfocused, as if watching something behind the screen. "Red door," he murmured. I froze. Seconds later, a red door appeared on the monitor. I exchanged a glance with my technician. We continued. "Old man, Black River," Ethan said. The words came out as a whisper, almost detached. The next slides followed exactly as he'd said. An elderly man's face, then a dark, winding river. The room fell silent. The only sound was the soft hum of the EEG machine and the faint clicking of the computer fan. My hands were cold. The data streamed across the monitor like proof of something I wasn't ready to believe. When the session ended, Ethan looked at me with exhausted eyes. "It's getting louder," he said. I asked what he meant. "The sound," he murmured. "Right before it happens, I hear this pulse. Like a heartbeat. But it's not mine." For a moment, I forgot my clinical detachment. The room felt smaller. The rhythmic beeping of the EEG seemed to sync with his words. A pulse, a pattern, a signal from something we didn't understand. That night, I stayed at the lab long after everyone else had gone home, staring at the neuroimaging data. Every time he predicted a future image, his brain's perceptual regions lit up before stimulation, like his mind had already seen what was coming. I wrote in my notes, "There are moments when science meets something it can't quantify. And when that happens, you don't feel enlightened, you feel terrified." And I was. Terrified, not of what Ethan could see, but of what his brain was trying to tell us. The days that followed blurred into one another. Ethan's condition worsened, his once methodical speech replaced by fragmented, anxious sentences. He told me the visions weren't just flashes anymore, they were episodes. "It's like I fall into them," he said, voice trembling. "One moment I'm here, and the next, I'm somewhere else. A few minutes ahead, sometimes hours," I tried to reassure him, to ground him in reality. But even as I spoke, his EEG displayed bursts of electrical chaos. Patterns firing through the parietal cortex and precuneus, regions tied to self-awareness and spatial perception. His brain was, quite literally, out of sync with time. He started keeping a journal, dates, times, and fragments of what he saw. I read it one evening. Tuesday, 2:13 a.m. The light above my bed flickers twice before Sarah calls my name. Wednesday, 4:06 p.m. Dr. Bennett drops her pen. Friday, 11:52 p.m. I'm not sure if I'm still me. When I asked him what that meant, he looked at me with a hollow calm. "Sometimes I feel like I'm watching myself from outside my own body," he said. "Like I'm stuck between the present and something that hasn't happened yet." I began recording every session, documenting his brain activity and behavior. In the footage, you can hear my voice trying to sound composed as I ask him questions. But in the quiet between my words, you can hear him breathing, shallow, quick, frightened. One afternoon, as we began another round of tests, Ethan suddenly pressed his palms to his temples and gasped. "Stop, please stop." The monitors spiked. His pupils dilated. For a moment, I thought he was seizing. Then he looked straight at me, terrified. "It's not random anymore," he said. "I'm seeing people die. I saw me." The silence that followed was unbearable. I wanted to end the session, but part of me, driven by scientific duty, or maybe denial, needed to understand. I asked him to describe what he saw. He hesitated, then whispered, "I was lying on the floor. You were there. You were calling my name. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the same expression he'd worn in that moment. Eyes wide, trapped somewhere my training couldn't follow. A week later, my phone rang just after midnight. The caller ID said emergency response. My heart sank before I even answered. Ethan had been found collapsed in his apartment. No trauma, no external injury, just a small trail of blood from his nose and a weak, fading pulse. By the time I arrived at the hospital, he was conscious, but dazed. His first words to me were barely audible. I saw it happen. I saw myself fall. Standing there, listening to him, I felt something I'd never felt in my entire career. Not confusion, not even fear. It was powerlessness. Because for the first time, I wasn't sure if what he'd seen had caused his collapse, or if it had simply predicted it. I returned to the clinic the following morning, determined to review every second of our recent sessions. If there was an explanation, technical, medical, or otherwise, I would find it. The lab was quiet, bathed in the soft hum of fluorescent light. The monitor screens flickered faintly as I queued up the recordings, each labeled with precise timestamps and data overlays. At first, everything appeared ordinary. Ethan seated across from me, the faint rhythmic beeping of the EEG machine, my voice calm and clinical as I read instructions. But then, around the midpoint of the last session, I noticed it. His EEG readings spiked before he spoke, before I even asked the next question. It wasn't just anticipatory behavior. It was temporal misalignment. His brain was reacting to moments that hadn't yet occurred. I slowed the footage, frame by frame. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the system clock. There were no recording lags, no corrupted files. Everything was synchronized. Still, the impossibility stared back at me in numbers and waveforms. And then came the sound. At first, it was almost imperceptible. A low, rhythmic pulse buried beneath the ambient noise. It repeated steadily, like a second heartbeat beneath the room's silence. My first thought was feedback from one of the devices, but the frequency didn't match any machine in the lab. It matched something else. Ethan had once told me about this sound, how it came seconds before each vision, how it grew louder when reality began to bend. Hearing it through my speakers made the back of my neck tighten. I leaned in closer, adjusting the volume. And that's when I heard it, a voice, faint, layered under the pulse, my own, whispering words I had never spoken during that session. He's already gone. I froze, rewound, played it again. The phrase repeated, unmistakable. My breath caught as I cross-referenced the audio logs. No other voices registered in the room, no secondary microphone inputs. The waveform analysis confirmed it. The whisper existed, but there was no sound source. I played it again, hoping to rationalize it, but instead, something even stranger happened. The EEG waveform on screen pulsed in sync with the whisper as though Ethan's brain had responded to it, seconds before the whisper occurred on the timeline. It made no sense. None of it did. And yet, there it was. Data that contradicted the very foundation of cause and effect. By the fifth replay, I wasn't thinking like a scientist anymore. I was just listening. The whisper seemed to linger longer each time, slightly louder, like it was aware of being observed. I stepped back from the desk, heart pounding. For the first time in my career, I shut the monitor off, not to save data, not to reset the system, but because I couldn't stand to hear my own voice again. I sat there in the darkened lab, surrounded by machines designed to measure thought, feeling something I hadn't in 20 years of neuropsychology, pure, unfiltered fear. I had built a life on understanding the mind's mechanics, but that night, as I stared at the blank monitor, I realized something terrifying. Maybe the mind wasn't just perceiving time. Maybe, in rare moments, it was touching it. Ethan reached out to me a few weeks later. His voice on the phone was quiet but steady, almost rehearsed. "I need to come in again," he said. "I have to know if it's still happening." There was a pause before I answered, a long one. Every instinct told me to refuse, to protect both of us. But curiosity and guilt overrode reason. I agreed to one final session. The clinic was unusually still that day. The late afternoon light filtered through half-drawn blinds, striping the room in uneven bands of gold and gray. Ethan looked frail when he arrived, his eyes sunken, his hands trembling slightly. Yet his composure was unnerving. "If it happens again," he whispered, "don't try to stop it." We began the test as we always did. Electrodes in place, stimuli randomized, every monitor recording. His EEG displayed a calm baseline, stable and rhythmic. For the first several minutes, everything appeared normal. Then, without warning, Ethan stopped responding. His eyes fixed on something beyond me, pupils widening as if he were watching an invisible event unfold. "Ethan?" I asked softly. He didn't answer. He inhaled sharply and whispered, "You shouldn't be here today." Before I could respond, the lights flickered. A faint hum filled the air, the same pulse I'd heard on the recording, vibrating through the walls like the rhythm of a slow heartbeat. Every monitor in the room glitched at once, screens blurring into static. The EEG flatlined for exactly 5 seconds. Not noise, not artifact. A perfect, measured absence. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything came back. The light steadied, the readings resumed. but Ethan wasn't breathing. I remember the sound of the chair scraping against the floor as I lunged forward. "Ethan, stay with me!" My voice broke as I checked his pulse, faint, fading. The monitor's alarm cut through the silence, shrill and accusing. I began compressions, counting under my breath, every push echoing in the still room. 1, 2, 3. I wasn't thinking about the data, or the research, or even the impossible events we documented. I was just trying to keep him here. When the medical team arrived, they took over quickly. Defibrillator pads, oxygen, the sharp rhythm of survival. After what felt like an eternity, his pulse returned. He gasped, eyelids fluttering, disoriented but conscious. And then, as I leaned closer, he looked directly at me. "I saw you," he whispered hoarsely. "You were trying to bring me back. From the other side." There was no fear in his eyes this time, only understanding, as though he'd crossed a boundary few ever glimpse. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him he'd imagined it, that his brain was misfiring, that hypoxia caused hallucinations, but the words caught in my throat. A week later, Ethan stopped speaking altogether. He was alive, but the spark that made him him seemed gone, like his consciousness was somewhere just out of reach. I still see his face sometimes when I close my eyes, the stillness, the calm, as though part of him was still there, watching from wherever he'd gone. It's been 11 years since that final session. I retired from clinical practice 2 years later, though if I'm honest, I stopped being a scientist that day in the lab. Now, most of my work involves teaching, consulting, and occasionally speaking about the boundaries of consciousness. But there are some stories I never share publicly. Ethan's is one of them. I record this from my home office, a quiet space filled with old case notes and soft lamplight. The rhythmic ticking of a wall clock keeps me company. Sometimes I catch myself watching the second-hand move, half expecting it to falter, to skip, as if time itself might stutter in acknowledgement of what I witnessed. In my years as a neuropsychologist, I built a career on understanding patterns of thought, memory, and perception. I believed every sensation, every emotion, could be traced to a neural pathway, a biochemical signal, a map of firing synapses. But Ethan shattered that certainty. He showed me that the mind might not always obey the physics of the body, that consciousness could stretch, slip, or even step outside the moment we call now. I've replayed that recording countless times. The faint pulse, the whispered phrase, "He's already gone." Every analysis says it shouldn't exist, that it's just digital interference, a glitch. But deep down, I know what I heard. And worse, I remember what I felt. The instant before the power flickered, when time seemed to fracture and reform, when the air itself seemed to hold its breath. I've asked myself whether I pushed Ethan too far, whether the pursuit of understanding made me blind to his fear. I told myself it was for science, that what we found could change everything we know about consciousness. But the truth is simpler and harder. I wanted to believe there was nothing left for us to discover, that medicine had already mapped the entire human mind. He proved me wrong. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I still wake to that same pulse, a low, steady rhythm that seems to come from the walls, the floor, maybe from within me. It fades as soon as I notice it, but it always leaves a trace, like an echo of something waiting to return. I used to think consciousness was contained, bounded by neurons and time. But maybe it isn't. Maybe some minds drift ahead, catching glimpses of what hasn't happened yet. Or maybe they simply never return completely. I still keep Ethan's final EEG file on an old hard drive. I don't open it often, but sometimes I catch my reflection in the dark screen before it loads, and for a heartbeat, I could swear I see the faint flicker of that impossible pulse. Because somewhere, in the quiet hum of the present moment, part of me still wonders if Ethan Miller ever truly came back.